Okay, so good morning. Good morning, everyone. Again, there's a bunch of things I wanted to touch on today, so I'm going to be jumping around a bit. So I haven't figured out any way to connect these things together. And the first thing I would like to do is share a few thoughts that I've had about pain and suffering since the last time we discussed pain and suffering. And then we will never discuss pain and suffering again, ever. No. I came across something this morning that was written by a Tibetan teacher. It kind of reminded me, it was, and he was dealing with this in a slightly different context. But what he talked about was, you know, if someone shoots you with an arrow in the shoulder, you know, first of all, that's on them. And certainly we would say, okay, that's pain, right? You get the arrow penetrating your shoulder. If you then grab the arrow and push it in deeper, that's suffering. Okay. So the pain is something that's caused by the circumstances. The suffering is something that we add to the circumstances. But I thought that example of the arrow made it very kind of give it a concrete clarity, you know. So we could say that about anything. I was talking about, you know, if you have a cold, the cold is the fact. But then we add, you know, we moan and we're self-pitying and we're, you know, thinking about all the things we can't do because we've got to stay home with this cold and so on and so forth, as opposed to just living with the cold. Now that goes to the other thing that came to me, you know, that and I'll contextualize this differently. Many years ago, when I first started Zen practice, I was sitting at Zen Mountain Monastery, and I know a number of you have sat there at one time or another, and they sit significantly longer than any sitting in the treetop world. I think about 35 minutes, something like that, and they absolutely do not allow any movement or any wiggling and so on and so forth. And when you're doing sesshin there, the days are quite long. They're probably sitting at least 50% more than a sesshin at treetop. Okay. And consequently, particularly for me as a new practitioner, there was a lot of pain. You know, it was darned uncomfortable. And as a consequence, I had to work with the pain. It was just so overwhelming, you know, you couldn't go around it. One of the things I found was, you know, there were several ways to deal with the pain. And one was to try to immerse myself in my practice. In those days, I was counting my breaths and just, I'm going to count. I'm not going to, you know, give my attention to the pain. But every once in a while, I went the other way. And the advice I was given was be the pain. So rather than resist the pain, rather than try to force it away somehow, it was just like, I'm going to go into this pain. I'm going to go into it as deeply. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to examine it. I'm going to experience it. And paradoxically, there were times when I did that when the pain disappeared completely. And so to me, that's the other strategy in terms of suffering. Eliminating suffering is non-separation. When I separate from the pain, it has power. When I am the pain, it loses its power and sometimes even disappears. And then I think, oh my God, this is great. The rest of this retreat is going to be so great. And then the next period that comes back and start all over again. But that's part of the nature of pain. And anyway, So does that make sense to folks? A little bit more about pain and suffering and that distinction? Good, good. Okay, that's all that I wanted to say about that. I want to talk a little about Shanti Deva this morning, but I'm going to do that a little further down the agenda here. But just so you know, I haven't forgotten him. He's rather unforgettable. And if any of you have done some reading in the last week, you will know that. Okay, so what I did want to talk about this morning was Shikan Taza. And again, back to the ancient times at Zen Mountain Monastery, very interesting. Daido Roshi used to make a sort of triage with students that came in. And I'm not sure exactly the chemistry that he used, but basically he divided people up into the people who would do koan study and the people who would do Shikan Taza. And at least in the culture of the Sangha, it was believed that that had a lot to do with his perception of your potential as a Zen student. Like, oh, the real serious students are going to do koans, and the rest that are kind of, we're going to just put them over here on Shikan Taza. I don't know whether that was true or not. I can't speak to what his thought process was, but that was certainly the belief, the understanding was that somehow the pearl was koan study and the chicken's egg was Shikan Taza, or whatever the opposite of a pearl would be. And that's colored my views on it for, I think, a very long time. But the longer that I've practiced, the more that I have come to have not just a respect, but almost a reverence for Shikan Taza as a form of practice. And I certainly do not any longer see it as hierarchical in any way. And in fact, I believe that both are essential components of our practice life. Yeah. And they do different things. They're not interchangeable. The more that I've looked at them, I don't see them as interchangeable. But equally valid, equally important in terms of practice. And I'm introducing this whole subject because those of you that are doing Daishan with me, you're going to see Shikan Taza pop up more often. There are going to be more times that I'm going to ask you to sit that way to kind of take a break from koan study. And I'm prefacing this in this way to make sure absolutely people understand that is not in any way a negative thing. It is not a punishment. It is not a sign of your failure at koan study. Absolutely not. It's just simply that it's a good time to do the other. I think that people's practices are going to be deepened and enhanced by having that blend of koans and Shikan Taza. And I'm going to talk about in a minute about how I see Shikan Taza, and because that's also changing. It's Shikan Taza is very elusive, and so we'll come to that. But anyway, so it's going to pop up more, and as I see it, it's different. Koan study is a very concentrated, focused practice. It's a very intimate practice. And in fact, that's the goal, right? If it has a goal, in a sense it does, is to be intimate with the koan, to be one with the koan, to kind of drop off all of our other thinking and analyzing and even our sense of our own being, and becoming completely intimate with that koan. And the idea is that when we arrive at that place of intimacy, the koan reveals itself. It's not something we have to do. It's not something we have to think about. It's something that is the result of the intimacy. Very intimate koan, but in a very sort of concentrated fashion. And if we were thinking about it in terms of a camera, the koan study is the telephoto lens. It focuses in on a very small area, in this case, the koan. Okay. Shikan Taza, on the other hand, is opening the broad field of awareness. Also intimate, but intimate in a different way. It is the wide angle lens. We're not discriminating at all. If we're trying not to discriminate at all. We're trying not to block anything out nor invite anything in, right? I've seen Shikan Taza, I guess, translated two ways. And they're so different that I'm not sure that either of them is a translation. One is that it's sometimes called choiceless awareness. And the one that's probably more likely that the actual translation is just sitting, right? Choiceless awareness, just sitting. They mean the same thing, but they kind of come from a different place. So choiceless awareness is just not letting our mind grasp any place, right? If any of you have worked with Shikan Taza, but you know that, our minds are like flypaper. We're always grasping something, we're always sticking someplace. And if we're doing Shikan Taza, as soon as we're aware that we're stuck, we let go. Get stuck, let go. Get stuck, let go. Across the whole vast sensorium, we're not picking and choosing. I'm not saying I've got to focus on this or I've got to focus on that. No, whatever comes, it comes and I let it go. That's what makes Shikan Taza practice extraordinarily challenging. We're working very directly with the stuff of our mind, the behavior of our mind. And we're excluding nothing. The whole universe. Choiceless awareness. We're not choosing. We're not picking. And so the bird sings, the bird sings. The dog barks, the dog barks. The neighbor screams at his cat. Whatever it is, it's there. It's right there for us. So I think it's easy to see how different that is from koan study. In koan studies, all those things would be superfluous. We don't want to pay attention to the bird. We don't want to hear the neighbor talking to his cat. We don't want, we're just move, to the exclusion of all else. And so you could perhaps see where both of these are valid and important. In a sense, the relationship to reality that we have in koan study is not something that we can export off the cushions in many of the contexts of our lives. There may be activities and tasks where we can intensely concentrate to the point of non-separation. But those are, but we can always be aware. We can always open our field of awareness. We can always directly experience reality. So both have a place and both cultivate something slightly different. Now, historically, and well, in the present day too, the idea had been that we do koan study first. Usually we start in our lineage with breath counting, then it's koan study. And then the idea is that when koan study is completed, Shikan Taza is the form of practice for the rest of our lives. Although there may be times or reasons we go back and sit with a particular koan, but in general, that's kind of seen as the trajectory, koan study. But that, as I said, I'm seeing it very differently now. I'm seeing that those two that ideally those two should interweave, because there are senses in which they are the same and there are senses in which they are different and irreplaceable. And so what I'm hoping to do as I'm working with those of you that I'm working with in a Daisan is to kind of find that rhythm and say, okay, now's the time we're going to shift over. We're going to look at it differently, and alter your practice. Okay. So any other questions about that?
I'll just mention that even though, I'm doing koans with you, my practice is like almost, my meditation practice is almost all Shikan Taza. I just feel like Shikan Taza is just absolutely essential to me. And so I don't know, the koan sort of exists in the background, and by the time we have Daisan, it seems like I usually have some kind of answer to present, but I don't sit concentratedly with the koan hardly at all sometimes. But I don't know what that's worth, but that's my experience.
Well, you're clearly a heretic. No, look, everybody comes up with their own alchemy, as it were, and how to work with koans. And everybody's approach is going to be a little bit different, and as you probably know, in other traditions, in Rinzai Zen, for example, and also, you don't get the koan until you walk into the Daisan room. And you're expected to respond right then and there. Teacher says, does a dog have Buddha nature? And you get to answer. And you either get it right or you get thrown out. That's kind of the, it's boom, boom, right there, very instantaneous. There's no, you don't get to know your koan a week or a month in advance and, sit with it. It's just, and here again, that cultivates something a little bit different, right? Our approach to koan study is more contemplative. And frankly, I think it cultivates greater intimacy. The other way cultivates spontaneity, cultivates responding in the moment, very fresh, very precognitively. Is one of those better than the other? I don't think so. They may each have value, but there's that idea that there's more than one way to approach koan study. And each of us is going to develop our own alchemy, and in all the way we sit with the koans. And some people like to do breath counting before they start. In each sitting, they start counting breaths for a while, kind of get in, and then go to the koan, or Shikan Taza first, and then go to the koan. So that's something to which there's no right answer. There's finding the alchemy that works for you. There's the approach that we take. That's essentially the approach that Maizumi Roshi taught, but it's far from the only approach. Furthermore, in Korean Zen, you only get one koan for your entire practice life. They don't have 1,000 koans. Well, they may have 1,000 koans, but you only get one. And you respond to that koan every time you come to Daisan for as long as you practice as a student, which is very interesting. If any of you have had the thought that, oh, I didn't go deep enough on this koan, well, try Korean Zen for a while. Any other thoughts or questions on that particular?
Some koans make for sleepless nights. It's hard to let go until they let you go, I guess.
It can be a very, very intense form of practice. Of course, at my age, the koans make for sleepy days. But yeah, it can be. It is an intense. You can't kind of coast on koans. Theoretically, I mean, if you coast, you can coast, and then nothing happens. If you really, to really penetrate the koans takes energy, and it takes commitment, and that kind of intensity. Okay, so be prepared. You may find more Shikan Taza popping up in our practice. Now I want to talk about Shanti Deva for a minute. I threw that out last time, that maybe we would spend some time with Shanti Deva and also with the Dalai Lama's book, which I guess someone told me now that the Dalai Lama changed his title. And did he just change his title, or did the book change? Does anybody know that? Nobody knows. Okay. Anyway. Now, immediately after I suggested that, I realized what a bad idea it was, because I saw all the left brains light up. I said, oh boy, we get to analyze. We get to think a lot. We get to critique. And so that is not my intention in suggesting this as a practice, or as a part of our study. So I'm wrestling with finding a way to avoid this becoming an intellectual endeavor, and to kind of approach it at a different, a more visceral level. Did any folks look at Shanti Deva this week? In this, someone found it online. Yeah. Okay. So if you read any of the Shanti Deva, you'll find it is very intimate, very personal. He's dialoguing with himself essentially, and totally nuts, by the way. I mean, if we tried to, we just can't. We cannot live like Shanti Deva. We can't, And so I offer that as much as something which is inspirational, because just like Shakyamuni Buddha reached a depth in his practice that we will never reach, Shanti Deva reached depths of compassion that we will never reach. But it's wonderful to have that exposure. And the Dalai Lama's book, I think, grounds it in a nice way. I don't know if anybody's been able to get that yet, but it's kind of a, I'd say the Dalai Lama contextualize it in a little bit more pragmatic way. So the question is, if folks still want to go forward and spend some time on this, and I don't want to spend, frankly, I do not want to spend a lot of time on it. We could do like chapter by chapter and be done in February or something, but I did want us to taste it, and I wanted to share about it. So the question is, do folks still want to go forward and do this? Let me stop there. That's question one. Now that you've had a chance to reflect on it, are we still going to do this? A couple of yeses.
Which Dalai Lama book are you talking about?
The title of mine is A Flash of Lightning in the Dark of Night, but somebody told me that title is now changed. It's not a very big book, about 130 pages or something, and as is the Shantideva. They're both short. They're kind of quick
The
reads.
the Dalai Lama one is For the Benefit of All Beings, the new one.
Thank you. And I don't know, Gary, do you know, is that a different edition of this same book, or is it possibly a new book?
I think it's just a different edition.
It's really good to take them together and read them together, even to go, Dalai Lama, this book follows Shantideva so that you can kind of read a section of one and then a section of the other. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do from pure sadistic nature. Is going to say, we're not going to discuss these, but you're going to write a verse. You're going to write a verse based on your experience of this study of compassion. And then we're going to read verses to one another. That was a device that Steph often used, was to ask us to write a verse after we read a sutra or read and I think his intention, I know his intention, was the same as mine is here. Let's get out of that left brain. To write a verse about something, we really need to connect with it on a more visceral level. We need to be kind of less thinking and analytical and more intimate, and hence the reason for that. So in a sense, this is not a book study. It's looking to touch our hearts in some way. It's interesting, that Tibetan teacher that I was reading this morning, that his thing was all about not shutting down our hearts. In some ways, we kind of, in Zen, it's both good and bad. We sort of take this direct path. We don't talk about our hearts in Zen. We don't talk very much about compassion in Zen. Historically, more and more contemporary teachers, American teachers in particular, but others too, are talking about compassion. There's more of this blending going on. Just as it's no longer really accurate to say that Theravadan Buddhism is concerned with individual liberation and not with the Bodhisattva vow. You know, I would say fair to say that most contemporary Theravadan teachers, again, particularly in the West, not necessarily maybe in Asia, but are as fully focused on compassion as are the Mahayana teachers. But the Tibetans are far ahead of us in that regard. They focus much more of their practice on compassion and on the active cultivation of compassion. And again, pros and cons. I think that the Zen assumption would be that liberating ourselves is of prime importance, and then everything else follows secondarily from that. And the Tibetans are cultivating these other things simultaneously with the path to liberation. And so that it's a longer path, you know, time-wise for them, it's a longer path in a sense, but for us, it means we've got to keep expanding our study, expanding our practice to encompass some of these things that traditionally Zen doesn't, you know. I mean, you know, if you look at traditional Zen stories, you know, you don't see much warm, fuzzy stuff. You know, just these students getting thrown out in the snow and beaten on the head, and you know, and there's a sense in which that is compassionate, but it's a fairly narrow sense. Okay, so once again, are there questions or thoughts?
Peter, I keep thinking about the way you started out talking about different ways of dealing with the pain. And I'm trying to incorporate that into our discussion of koans or Shikan Taza or other aspects of opening your heart. And it would seem that the going to the pain would be more the koan, the focus, whereas Shikan Taza is would be just letting the pain go. I don't know if it's an important distinction, but I keep going back to trying to put it in a category that my left brain likes to do.
I think that's true to an extent. I mean, again, going back to the instance of the cold, if I'm sort of taking the koan approach to the cold, I'm being the cold. I'm eliminating any separation. Oh boy, I'm like feeling the mucus and, you know, coughing the cough with my whole body and mind. I am intimate with the cold. And on the other hand, the sort of Shikan Taza would be, I'm opening it all up, and the cold is just one thing here, and there's the birds are singing, and, you know, there's the people talking, and that's whatever it is, you know, it's got the entire sensorium. So even something as simple as how we deal with a cold, yes, it could be seen in either of those ways. And maybe you've all done that, you know, to some, probably most of us haven't done the be the cold route, but you know, they both eliminate the suffering. They eliminate the struggle and the struggle that comes out. They're both paths to non-separation, but they go by a different way.
And in that particular case, it would seem that that there would be some element of self-compassion in either focusing or letting go. Either one is being compassionate to yourself, to not dwell with the suffering.
Yeah, you know, self-compassion. Now we're gonna open another bag of worms here. You know, it's interesting because historically, particularly in Zen, self-compassion is not even spoken of. And there may be a very valid reason for that. I have a book coming. It's coming, I think, maybe Monday, tomorrow, that I just came across, it's a dialogue between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. But one of the things that is talked about in there, and I think this is the fundamental Buddhist approach, fundamental Zen approach, is they're suggesting, at least in the review I read of this book, that the best solution to pain is to help others. Not to focus on our own pain at all, but to be aware of the suffering of others and to be active toward eliminating the suffering of others. So there's yet another sort of approach to this whole question of suffering, you know, and certainly that I would say that's the Dalai Lama's view, you know, self-compassion, you know, self-care, those things don't come up. It's all about who can I help? Who needs my help? But certainly that's something we've modified a lot here in the West. I don't know for better or for worse, frankly. You know, again, you know, we've done so much of blending Buddhist practice with psychology in the West. And certainly self-care, self-compassion are important concepts in psychological concepts and psychotherapeutic concepts. And in that context, they're absolutely valuable, you know, absolutely valuable. And, you know, but classic Zen, I think, would say, don't worry about self-esteem. Don't worry about how you feel, you know, don't worry about that. Focus on the Dharma, you know, and at least one problem with that is there would be lots of people who won't stick around long enough to focus on the Dharma because their pain is so intense and their suffering is so intense that they cannot do it. Right? I mean, you know, pain is one of the things that drives many people to Buddhist practice, suffering in our lives. You know, no matter how sort of much more altruistic we become over time, initially, it's like, okay, my life sucks. I need to do something. I'm going to go try this Buddhism thing. You know, I mean, that's kind of many people come to the cushions. You know, and if we defer all of that sort of self-care and, you know, till after, you know, like after enlightenment or something, well, then a huge percentage of people would not make it. They would, you know, they wouldn't stay in practice. And in fact, I think that happens. I think that happens a great deal. The intensity of the psychological pain is like, you know, okay, you feel really shitty. I've got a solution for you. Just sit on that cushion for 15 years and you're going to feel better, you know. And then you got a psychotherapist over here who says, oh, we can work together for 6 months. And I think you're going to feel a lot better. Which one are you going to choose? And then somebody else over here says, hey, I've got the best weed you've ever smoked. And you're going to feel better right now. You know, there are these sort of range of choices that people have.
Peter, what do you do with the very early teaching? The 3, strive not to do harm, do good for others. And that middle one, to me, must mean do good to me, because we've got do good to others and we've got not doing harm. Well, what is that middle one? And it doesn't mean make me the focus of the universe, but at some level, there is kindness to self that isn't self-indulgent and isn't harmful to others and allows help for others. I'm just raising it as a question.
Well, it's a good question, and I actually, Margaret, I don't know the answer to that. I've always seen that a little differently, but you know, it's like the question of right livelihood. We know very clearly what's not right livelihood, right? You're going to be an arms manufacturer. You're going to be, you know, I don't know what, a drug lord. Not right, you know. And over here, we know what right livelihood, you know, if you're working for an NGO in Africa in impoverished communities, I mean, there's like unambiguously, you know, good. And then there's a lot of in-between stuff. Being an accountant, you know, was it's not unambiguously helping the world, and it's not harming the world, but it's just, okay, I'm doing these, you know, I'm doing these things. I don't know. That's how I've seen it, but what you've just suggested is as far as I'm concerned, an equally valid understanding. You know, it's one that I hadn't thought of.
I was just thinking that it seems like in Zen, the compassion towards self is the disillusion of the self. So you're transcending self problems by essentially liquidating or vaporizing self, and how that's a really tough sell in to non-practitioners or folks, you know, who are just looking to have relief, thinking from like a psychotherapy, you know, versus psychotherapy versus Zen. You know, I think a lot of psychotherapists would have a hard time if someone's sitting across from you and you're saying, well, you know, why don't you just sort of recognize the oneness of all beings or all things and not yourself. You probably wouldn't go too far.
I have to say, I've had a lot of psychotherapy when I was younger and stuff, and I've got like critical inner voices that are probably the main bane of my existence. And the psychotherapy didn't really change that, unfortunately. Maybe with a different psychotherapist it would have, I don't know, but Shikan Taza does. So to me, Shikan Taza is self-care that works.
I would chime in on that and say I was in therapy when I first came to Zen, and the therapy progressed at warp speed once I began doing serious sitting. It was enormously helped. I don't understand why, but it was.
Yeah, that's something that I believe is true. I mean, that, you know, that Zen practice can supercharge psychotherapy. And there's a very good synergy there. And of course, many therapists know that. That's why they introduce mindfulness into a whole array of therapeutic interventions. And so maybe, and the answer might be that, Margaret, is just the same way that, you know, the piece of Zen that is mindfulness might be what's helping with the psychotherapy, that we're more present, we're more aware of our own internal processes. You know, I think before we start sitting, we're on autopilot all the time. And then we're starting like, oh, look at all these little tapes that are running in my head. And, and all
Maybe
this.
that part is the doing good, as opposed to doing good to others, without being consciously doing good to self. Just an idea.
Yeah, no, it's, you know, yeah, I don't know. I just tried, one of the things I just dragged back from Treetop, because I saw, you know, I have most of my libraries at Treetop in it. So this, you can't even see it because the cover is, it's so ancient, the cover is mostly gone. But this is Wapola Raula, What the Buddha's what the Buddha taught. And it's old. It's an old book. I was just looking to see when it was published. I was going to say in the 60s, but I was wrong. 1959 was copyrighted, and yet I think he captured the early teachings of the Buddha with a lot of clarity, and so I like coming back to him from time to time when I'm trying to get more clarity on what, you know. So this, I'm going to see if there's something in here that will reflect on that. You know, it's interesting. This is just a book that has stuck with me in terms of understanding the Theravadan teachings. And when if you're interested in that, what the Buddha taught, this is an interesting book. And it's another book that can make you absolutely insane. You know, getting into all the Sanskrit terminology and Indian concepts. And you know, we're sort of close out here, but you know, that's the other thing. You know, there are things that the Buddha said that I believe are as true today as they were the day that he said them, and they will be just as true 40 years from now when the world ends. But that said, nobody thought that was funny. Okay, but but there are other things. I think this world is intrinsically different. I've said that before. The existential threats are so numerous and so great. You know, that to say, okay, let's go off in the forest and meditate the rest of our lives. You know, I just or even into a monastery, or you know, I think, and I think it's you know, I think I mentioned this friend and I are doing this, putting together this podcast series, and so I'm just kind of more looking out for things, and every day I'm seeing more Buddhist teachers coming out, taking strong stands on the environment and on climate change. You know, it was there was just a nice piece that was Tricycle that had David Loy and Joan Halifax and a third teacher. And it was interesting. It was interesting in terms of the work that we're doing, because David Loy had a fairly traditional, you know, get off your asses and get out and do things thing. Joan had a very interesting thing about, she used hospice as an analogy, and the coming alongside with the patient. She analogized that to how we should approach the destruction in the world. And then the third guy had an approach very similar to mine, and he's in Northern California, I think, and he's working with taking people out in the woods and building intimacy with nature. So it was interesting to see those three approaches. But the sort of the good news is there are more and more Buddhist teachers actively using the Dharma to address these issues. You know, it was, and in the UK, lots going on in the UK. That's where I would say that's the epicenter of eco-Dharma right now in the world. Maybe because Joanna Macy has, you know, been there for decades. But, you know, and there's a whole group called Extinction Rebellion Buddhists, who are young activists that are out there, but bringing Buddhist principles into their protests. Very interesting, a lot of interesting stuff going on.